The smell of hickory smoke was still floating across my backyard when I heard Karen's voice cut through the evening like she had been waiting all day for her moment. It was supposed to be one of the easiest nights of the week, just a simple Saturday barbecue at my house. Nothing loud, nothing out of control, nothing that should have bothered anybody. I had burgers going on the grill, ribs slow smoking near the patio, my cousins laughing around the picnic table, and my nephew trying to steal extra corn before dinner was even ready. The sun was low, the string lights were on, and for the first time in days, the whole evening actually felt calm. Then Karen stepped out on her deck like an actress hitting her mark. She didn't come out to ask a question. She didn't come out to talk like a neighbor. She came out with that same sharp voice and that same superior attitude she always used when she thought she had the upper hand. "You people never learn, do you?" she shouted, loud enough for everybody in my yard to hear. "I already called the police. Let's see how relaxed you are when they get here." The whole table went quiet for a second. My aunt looked over at me. My friend Marcus lowered his drink and muttered, "She really did it this time." And right then, like she had summoned them herself, red and blue lights flashed at the end of the street. Karen folded her arms and smiled. That smile told me everything. She thought she had finally found a way to embarrass me in front of everybody. She thought this was the night she was going to prove I was the problem. She thought those police lights were her victory lap. What she didn't know was that by the time that cruiser stopped in front of my house, she had already made the biggest mistake she'd made in this whole neighborhood mess. To understand why Karen was standing there acting like she had just won a court case, you have to understand something first. This was never really about barbecue smoke. The smoke was just the excuse. That cookout wasn't some wild block party. We weren't blasting music, nobody was drunk, nobody was yelling, nobody was fighting. It wasn't one of those nights where people spilled into the street and forgot they had neighbors. It was a normal family gathering in my own backyard, on my own property, the kind of thing we had done more times than I could count. The grill was where it always was, the smoker was legal, the guests were invited, and the noise level was lower than what half the neighborhood made on a Saturday morning just mowing their lawns. But by then, I already knew Karen's pattern. She could ignore something when somebody else did it. But if I did the same thing, suddenly it became a neighborhood concern. If kids laughed in my yard, she noticed. If my family parked a little too long near the curb, she noticed. If I had guests over 2 weekends in a row, somehow that became a matter of community standards. So when she called the police over backyard smoke, I already knew this wasn't about smoke drifting over a fence line. This was about control. And Karen had been building toward that moment for a lot longer than anyone standing around my grill realized. I'm not a guy who goes looking for neighborhood drama. I've lived in that house long enough to know the rhythm of the street. I know who leaves early for work, which dog barks every time the mail truck comes around, which porch lights stay on too late, and who actually minds their business. That house was never just some temporary stop for me. It was home. I treated it like home too. I kept the yard clean, I waved when people walked by, I handled my business without making it everybody else's problem. That mattered to me because I was raised to believe that living around other people means carrying yourself in a way that makes life easier, not harder. So I did what decent neighbors do. I kept music at a reasonable level, I gave people a heads up if friends were coming over, I cleaned up after every cookout. If smoke ever drifted too far, I adjusted the grill before anyone even had to say anything. In other words, I gave Karen no real reason to come after me. The people who actually knew me knew that. They had eaten in my backyard, borrowed tools from my garage, and asked me to watch their place when they went out of town. I wasn't perfect, but I was steady, respectful, predictable. And I think that was part of what irritated Karen the most. Because some people don't start fights over what you do wrong. They start fights because they can't stand the fact that you won't bend when they act like they own everything around you. And Karen had been trying to bend me for months. She didn't move into the neighborhood and suddenly become difficult overnight. People like her rarely do. They start small, they test things, they look for little ways to see how much control they can get before anyone pushes back. At first, it was comments disguised as concern. She'd catch me while I was taking out the trash and mention that my grill cover looked a little worn. She'd ask if I really needed to have guests over as often as I did. She'd make little remarks about how standards matter if you want to live in a nice neighborhood. Then it grew. If my cousin parked in front of my house for too long, she noticed. If a package sat on my porch for a few hours while I was at work, she noticed. If I trimmed hedges on a Sunday afternoon, somehow Karen noticed that too. And she never said it like a normal person. She always had that same tight smile, that same fake polite voice, the kind of tone people use when they're trying to sound reasonable while quietly collecting evidence in their head. She was the kind of woman who said, "I'm not trying to start anything," right before proving that starting something is exactly what she came to do. At first, I gave her the benefit of the doubt. I told myself maybe she was just lonely. Maybe she liked control because the rest of her life felt out of control. Maybe if I stayed calm long enough, she'd eventually realize I wasn't interested in playing her little power game. But my calm didn't settle her down. If anything, it made her more irritated. Every time she made a complaint and I answered it reasonably, she lost the argument she was trying to build. She wanted emotion. She wanted a scene. She wanted me angry enough to look guilty. And when she couldn't get that from me, she started looking for something bigger. By the time that barbecue weekend came around, Karen wasn't looking for peace anymore. She was looking for a stage. That Saturday started the way a good cookout day is supposed to start. By late afternoon, the whole backyard smelled like seasoning, charcoal, and smoke settling into warm air. My brother had dropped off a cooler earlier. My cousins were working on the sides. My aunt was already warning everybody they were going to eat too much and regret it later. Nothing about the night felt unusual. It felt familiar, comfortable, the kind of evening that reminds you why people would rather gather around a backyard grill than spend a fortune going somewhere fancy. I had the grill going near the patio and the smoker running a little farther back. Music was on, but low enough that the loudest thing in the yard was still my nephew laughing every time someone chased him away from the food.
A few neighbors passed by, waved, and kept walking. Nobody looked upset. Nobody acted bothered. Nobody except Karen. The first time I really noticed her that evening, she was standing near the edge of her deck, not relaxing, not reading, not doing anything normal, just standing there with her arms folded, chin slightly lifted, watching my yard like she was waiting for me to mess up. I ignored her. A little while later, I looked up and saw her again, this time holding her phone in our direction a little too long. Maybe she was taking pictures. Maybe she was recording. Either way, she wanted a record of something, even if she had to create the reason later. That was the moment I knew she was setting a trap. About 20 minutes after that, she leaned toward the fence line and said loudly enough for several people to hear, "This is exactly the kind of mess I've been documenting." I turned toward her and said as calmly as I could, "Karen, it's a family barbecue." She gave me that same thin smile and said, "Not for much longer." Less than 10 minutes later, the police lights showed up at the end of the street. The cruiser rolled in slow, the way an officer drives when he already suspects the call probably doesn't match the drama in the report. Karen, on the other hand, moved fast. Before the car had even fully stopped, she was halfway down her driveway, one hand already pointing toward my backyard like she was directing some kind of raid. The expression on her face said it all. She wasn't expecting a conversation. She wasn't expecting a warning. She was expecting me to be embarrassed in front of everybody standing there with paper plates and plastic cups. The officer stepped out, closed the door, and took one calm look at the yard. Nobody was yelling. Nobody was stumbling around drunk. Nobody was fighting. My family was still standing near the patio, looking more confused than guilty. The music was low, the grill was contained, the smoker was exactly where it always was. In about 3 seconds, it was obvious this was not the emergency Karen had tried to sell. Then the officer looked directly at me, and for half a second, neither of us said anything, because the man standing there in uniform was my older brother. Now, let me be clear about something. My brother wasn't the kind of officer who played favorites. and I wasn't about to act like I had some special shield just because we shared the same last name. If anything, I knew he'd be even more careful because of it. He wasn't going to do me any favors. He was going to do his job. Karen, of course, had no idea. To her, he was just the officer she thought she had called in to prove her point. He kept his face professional and asked who made the complaint. Karen stepped forward immediately. That was the moment I knew this was about to go very differently than she expected. She started talking so fast you'd think she'd spent the last hour rehearsing in a mirror. She pointed at the smoker, then at my guests, then at the yard. She spoke like every completely normal thing in front of her was part of some giant public disturbance. According to her, the smoke was out of control, the noise had been non-stop for hours, the gathering was creating an unsafe environment for the neighborhood. Listening to her, you would have thought I was throwing some huge street party instead of feeding ribs to relatives in folding chairs. My brother let her talk. That was the part Karen didn't understand. A calm officer doesn't always interrupt when someone starts over-explaining. Sometimes he just waits, because the more somebody talks, the more chances they have to trip over the truth. When Karen finally finished, he started asking simple questions. How many people were here? Was there amplified music? Had anyone threatened her? Had anyone entered her property? Karen answered every question with the same dramatic certainty people use when they think confidence can take the place of facts. But every answer fell apart the second it touched reality. There were no crowds spilling into the street. The music was so low he didn't even ask me to turn it down. No one had crossed onto her property.
Nobody was drunk. Nobody was fighting. And the smoke? It was controlled, contained, and no heavier than what comes off any legal backyard smoker on a weekend. Then he did something that shifted the whole moment. He looked past Karen and asked two of my guests what time they had arrived and whether there had been any issue before the call. Their answers matched mine exactly. Quiet family cookout, normal evening, no problem until Karen started shouting. That was when I saw the first crack in her confidence. It was small, just a brief change in her face, but I caught it. Because she had expected authority to show up and immediately back her up. Instead, authority was doing something she had not planned for, checking. And once the facts started getting checked, her complaint stopped looking like a report. It started looking personal. Once my brother saw that the scene didn't match Karen's version of events, the whole energy changed. He didn't get louder, he got quieter, more focused, more exact, the way professionals do when they realize the real issue may not be the thing being reported, but the person making the report. He asked Karen when exactly the disturbance began. She gave one time. Then he asked how long the excessive noise had been going on. She gave another. Then he asked what made the smoke dangerous. Suddenly, she stopped using clear answers and started using vague ones. It was everywhere. It was overwhelming. It was affecting the neighborhood. But none of that matched what he could see, hear, or verify. Then he asked one more question in that same calm tone. Have you made prior calls involving this address? Karen hesitated. It wasn't long, maybe a second, but that second said a lot. Because hesitation tells its own story. He looked at me, then at the yard, then back at Karen, and I could tell he had already figured out what this really was. Not a safety issue, not a nuisance emergency, just another attempt to use a badge and a dispatch line to pressure somebody she couldn't control on her own. He made a few notes, then explained there was no violation that required enforcement. And then he told her something that hit a lot harder than she expected. He warned her that repeated unfounded complaints could create a record she might not like later. That landed hard, because Karen had called the police trying to build a record against me. Instead, she had just started building one against herself. The woman who had marched down her driveway like she was about to shut my whole night down suddenly looked like she wanted the ground to open up beneath her. She muttered something about just trying to protect the neighborhood, then turned and walked back toward her house without another word. The cruiser pulled away a minute later. My family slowly settled back in. The grill kept going, and the night somehow refused to let one entitled neighbor ruin it. But the real damage to Karen didn't happen that evening.
It happened the next morning. Because neighborhoods talk. By breakfast, people already knew she had called the police over a quiet family barbecue and got told there was no violation. By noon, the version spreading down the block was even worse for her. Karen had tried to make a scene, and the scene had folded in on her. The same neighbors she always wanted to impress with her standards were now looking at her like she had crossed the line from strict to ridiculous. Even people who usually stayed out of everything had opinions now. It's one thing to be picky. It's another thing entirely to call the police on a family cookout and get publicly corrected. After that, something changed. Not with me, with her. The complaints slowed down. The staring stopped. The little control games lost their force. Because once people see that your outrage doesn't have anything solid behind it, it stops feeling like power. It just starts sounding like noise. What stayed with me after that night wasn't the police lights. It wasn't even Karen's face when she realized her complaint was falling apart. It was how quickly borrowed authority collapses when the facts finally show up. Karen thought calling the cops would give her instant power. She thought a uniform, a report, and a little public embarrassment would accomplish what months of nagging and control couldn't. But when you make a call out of spite instead of truth, you're taking a gamble. And sometimes, the record you try to create against someone else becomes the record that exposes you. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to turn it into a bigger scene than she already had. I just needed to stay calm long enough for the truth to do its job. And after that night, Karen never looked at my backyard barbecues the same way again. Because some backfires happen in private, and some happen where the whole neighborhood can see.